So this week I heard a story that our own Peter Bush once entered a monastery where somehow he agreed to take an extended vow of silence. And Peter was only allowed to speak 2 words every 6 months. After the first 6 months, he was brought before the leader, and Peter said, "Bed hard." After the next 6 months, he told the leader, "Food bland." Now, if you know Peter at all, you likely won't be surprised by what he said after 18 months. He said, "Miss friends." 6 months after that, when he stood before the leader, Peter said, "I quit." And the leader kind of rolled his eyes and said, "It doesn't surprise me at all, Peter. I mean, all you've done since you got here is complain." I thought I should try to start today with something funny, as lame as it was, because the verse at the core of today's Bible portion is anything but funny. The words are blunt and direct, and they don't allow for any loopholes or exceptions. And it's written in the imperative form, the command form. And Paul wrote, "Do everything without complaining and arguing." And having that front and center through a full week of studying had me convicted and confessing and repenting repeatedly as the Holy Spirit kept bringing to mind examples of times I've fallen short on that command. And if you can relate at all, at least we're in good company, because in another letter, Paul admitted, "I want to do what's good, but I don't. I don't want to do what's wrong, but I do it anyway." I don't know about you, but I cannot wait to hang out with Paul because I think we have at least a few key things in common. He wrote, "Do everything without complaining and arguing." The word for everything meant, well, everything. Do everything without complaining. Many other Bible versions use either grumbling or murmuring. The original word was closer to murmuring. One Bible commentary calls it a secret displeasure in the heart and a sullen discontent that leads to criticism. One definition of the word was to mutter under your breath. Bible historian William Barclay says the word was used for a kind of growling, discontented undertone. He said it's the word used for the grumbling of the children of Israel in the wilderness when they complained against Moses. He said they muttered the complaints they were afraid to utter out loud. There's a small but graphic line in the Psalms that captures that very thing, describing the way the Israelites sulked and complained in their tents. Now, I suspect we've all done some version of that. Paul added to his command, "Do everything without complaining and arguing." Now, the word for arguing was similar to the one for complaining, but with like the volume turned up. It makes me think of the time Jesus said, "The mouth speaks what the heart is full of." Now, a modern version of the mouth speaking would add, "The fingers text or type what the heart is full of." The amount of activity online would drop drastically if all forms of grumbling, murmuring, complaining, and arguing were removed completely. This is how one of the more recent Bible translations has the verse, "Do all things without complaining or bickering with each other." This is part of a sermon on the verse by well-known 19th century pastor Jack Arnold. He said, "What is the worst sin a person can commit? Is it adultery, homosexuality, murder, rape? It's difficult to say that any sin is worse than any other sin. However, if we read the Old Testament carefully, we will find that the sin of complaining, grumbling, and murmuring was a sin which brought great judgment from God. God hates a grumbling and complaining spirit." I told you, this week's studying had me convicted, confessing and repenting repeatedly. Well, Pastor Arnold continued, complaining seems to be the American way of life. Most conversations are complaints about the government, the economy, taxes we pay, and even about the weather. He continued, among Christians we hear complaints about the sermon. Too long, too dry, too pointed. Or there are complaints about the congregation. Too large, too cold, too small, too emotional, or too impersonal. Complaining, he said, is not just an American pastime, it is a human race pastime, because all men have a sin nature, which tends toward the negative rather than the positive. And then he said complaining is a spiritual problem, and it has to be dealt with and spiritually defeated. Complaining is a spiritual problem, and it has to be dealt with and spiritually defeated. Now, while it may not look like it at first, that is really good news. It makes it clear that on our own, we don't have a chance of carrying out the command, do everything without complaining and arguing. Good news is, we absolutely don't have to do it on our own. Look at what Paul wrote right before the command. He said, God is working in you, giving you the desire to obey him and the power to do what pleases him. Let's break that into smaller bites. God is working in you. That's what the song Waymaker gets us admitting to God, when it leads us in singing, proclaiming, confessing. Even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop. You never stop working. God is working in you. Out of the three in the Trinity, the Holy Spirit leads the work in people. Go back to Pastor Arnold's line. Complaining is a spiritual problem, and it has to be dealt with and spiritually defeated. Well, Christian, that is one of the main things God is doing while he is working in you. And God is working in you, giving you the desire. As it so often does, the Amplified Bible expands on giving us the desire. It says God is strengthening, energizing, and creating in you a longing. The Holy Spirit works in us, in our desires, in what we long for. And one of the primary things the Holy Spirit is doing in us is transforming our want-tos. God is working in you, giving you the desire to obey him. And without a Spirit-fed desire for that, without a longing for that, nobody would even care about obeying God. God is working in you, giving you the desire to obey him and the power to do what pleases him. So the Holy Spirit gives us the want to and the can do. So what pleases God, at least in this context? Well, that's in the next thing Paul wrote. It pleases God when we do everything without complaining or arguing. Now, the word for do was written in a way that meant in your doing or as you do. And that means this was more literally like whatever you're doing. And that would make this, whatever you're doing, do it without grumbling or murmuring or complaining. But, you say, Paul never met my boss, or Paul never met my coworkers, or my kids, or my teacher, or Paul never had a computer crash, or had the kinds of politicians we do, or had to drive on the 405, or be on hold with the DMV for more than an hour. I mean, could Paul have literally meant do everything without complaining or arguing? It would be unrealistic, if not impossible, if not for the promise we just saw. God is working in you, giving you the desire to obey him and the power to do what pleases him. And the next thing Paul wrote lets us see one of the main reasons it pleases God when we're not complaining or arguing. To see the reason, we need to go back to the Israelites when their complaining and arguing was worse than ever. You likely have even a tiny idea of what it was like if you've done a long car trip with your kids, or from the other side, if you've done a long car trip with your parents. When it comes to the Israelites, we're talking about millions of people who had been walking around a desert for 40 years. Can you even begin to imagine? Are we there yet? The promised land's supposed to be east, but we keep heading south. I'm so tired of manna. I'm thirsty. I never voted for Moses in the first place. And the murmuring hit the point where it permeated everything they did. And one glaring example of it came when God was meeting with Moses up on Mount Sinai, so he could give him the 10 Commandments. Well, back down the mountain, the murmuring and the grumbling was out of control. And it says, when the people saw that Moses was so long coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and they said, "Make us gods who will go before us." And catch this, as for this fellow Moses, who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't even know what happened to him. Well, Aaron caved to the pressure, and he told the Israelites to bring him all the gold jewels the Egyptians had handed over after God stirred up enough plagues to convince Pharaoh to let them leave. Well, Aaron took all the gold and melted it down and had it turned into the statue of a calf, and they declared it a god. That means while Moses was up the mountain getting the 10 Commandments, including the one that condemned making idols, the Israelites were doing that very thing. Well, up on the mountain, God told Moses what was going on. And when Moses approached the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, his anger burned, and he threw the tablets out of his hands, breaking them to pieces at the foot of the mountain. And he took the calf they had made, and they burned it in the fire, and then he ground it to powder, and he scattered it on the water, and he made the Israelites drink it. Then Aaron told one of the strangest lies in the Bible. It is so bad it's almost funny. He said, "Don't be angry, my Lord. You know how prone these people are to evil. They said to me, 'Make us gods who will go before us.' As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him. So I told them, 'Whoever has any gold jewelry, take it off.' And then they gave it to me, and I threw it in the fire, and out came this calf." Catch that lie. They gave me the gold, I threw it in the fire, and out came a calf. I told you, it's such a bad lie, it's almost funny. But grumbling easily gives birth to arguing, and arguing often leads to uglier things. So we shouldn't be surprised to see how the story continued. And Moses saw the people were running wild, and that Aaron had let them get out of control, and so became a laughingstock to the nations. A laughingstock to the nations. Whew. See, the nations around them were aware of what the Israelites said they believed about the God they claimed to follow. This God of peace and love and unity. But the way they were behaving had become a joke to all the other people because it was such a blatant contradiction to what the Israelites claimed to believe. And that's why they became a laughingstock. And contrast that with where we are this morning. When Paul wrote, In everything you do, stay away from complaining and arguing, so that no one can speak a word of blame against you. Now that meant a legitimate criticism against you. And he continued, you're to live clean, innocent lives as children of God in a dark world full of crooked and perverse people. Let your lives shine brightly before them. Nobody has to be taught to grumble, to murmur, or to complain. We all come by it naturally. It's disturbingly easy sometimes to start picking away at our children, our spouse, our parents, our church, our boss, our employees, and even people we don't know. It can easily get out of hand, and there isn't anything like it to eat away at unity. And just like it was for the nations watching the Israelites, people outside the church can end up very confused about the God we claim to follow when we're grumbling and murmuring and complaining and arguing. Now, at the same time, people outside the church will notice people who don't grumble, who don't complain, who don't argue. Because people like that stand out. It's like they literally shine, now more than ever. But it can be hard to be that kind of a person. And Paul knew that, which is why he wrote something we looked at a few weeks ago. He said, work hard to show the results of your salvation. That phrase, work hard, often applied to the way a farmer would work his field. The Philippians would have understood it. If you want a good harvest, you have a lot of hard work to do. The same word was used in athletics, as in work out or sweat. Put your whole heart into your training. And hold that beside something else Paul wrote in another letter. Growing strong in body is all right, but growing in God-like living is more important. Back in Philippians, Paul wrote, work out your salvation. It's as though he wanted to challenge each person in a local church to look in a mirror and ask the Holy Spirit to show us what kind of an impact we are having on unity. Does a dark world full of crooked and perverse people see light coming from me? Or do I just create more shadows? It's like praying a couple of lines from one of King David's songs. Search me, O God. Search me thoroughly and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any wicked or hurtful way in me, and lead me in the everlasting way. Now, the words search, test, and lead were written in a way that more literally meant keep searching me, keep testing me, keep leading me. It was the same with what we just saw from Paul. Keep working out your salvation. And he added that we're to do it with fear and trembling. But that's not the fear and trembling of an athlete waiting for a boot in the backside from a grumpy coach. It's not a fear that drives us away from God, but a fear that makes us turn to Him, knowing we are so lost without Him. Knowing we need Him that much can be at least a little scary. This kind of fear also comes from what Bible historian William Barclay called a horror of grieving God. Adding, when we really love someone, we're not afraid of what He may do to us. We're afraid of what we may do to Him. But fear and trembling is not meant to get us hiding safely in our homes or our churches or our groups. I mean, look at something Jesus prayed for us. Don't miss what Jesus prayed to God for us. My prayer is not that you take them out of the world. Which is why Paul wrote, in everything you do, at the office, in the car, in the class, in the line, in the gym, in the bleachers, online, in everything you do, stay away from complaining and arguing. You are to live clean, innocent lives as children of God in a dark world full of crooked and perverse people. Let your lives shine brightly before them. If I gave everyone a paper and a pencil and asked you each to draw a crooked 10-inch line, do you think any of the lines would be the same? There are all kinds of ways to draw a crooked line. There is only one kind of straight line. The original word for crooked was scolios. That may sound familiar. Scoliosis of the spine is a backbone that's been curved or twisted in an unnatural way. A crooked generation or a crooked person is one that is bent or twisted in a way that it was not originally designed to be. If the generation is crooked, and we strive to be straight, but not in the limited way the word straight was reduced over the past several decades to just refer to sexuality. If the generation is crooked and we strive to be straight, we will stand out. Sometimes so much so that we shine. And that word meant to reflect light. The word meant to be noticeable because of what, I would say in this case, because of who we radiate in the midst of, among crooked people in the dark. Jesus said the healthy don't need doctors. The sick people do. People in the dark are the ones who need the light. And the Bible makes it clear dark things don't like the light. So there will be people out there that will recoil if the light reflecting off of us comes near them. Oh, we're going to take shots from some of them. Likely increasing shots from them. That's why we don't need extra shots from within us. But despite the way it can feel, most people out there don't take shots at us. It's just that they're in the dark. And it's like they can't find the light switch. And some are scared. Some are frustrated. Some are angry. Some are just tired of being in the dark. And something inside them tells them they need light. A lot of people are looking for it, whether they realize it or not. And Paul made it clear, one of the most powerful ways we can show them light is quite simple. Not necessarily easy, but simple. And there's a difference between simple and easy. Paul said, if you want people to notice there's something different about you as you make your way through the day, don't grumble. Don't murmur. Don't complain. Don't argue. I said it was simple, but not necessarily easy. Then, if people ask how in the world we're able to do that, we let them know. And that's why Paul wrote, do all you have to do without grumbling or arguing, so that you may be God's children, blameless, sincere, and wholesome, living in a warped and diseased world, and shining there like lights in a dark place. For you hold in your hands the very word of life.